There are places in the world where history feels incomplete, where something extraordinary happened, yet the full story was never told. Even today, despite all the progress of modern science, there are mysteries that remain untouched by explanation, as if they exist just beyond the reach of understanding. One of the most enduring of these mysteries rises from the scorching desert of Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza. For more than 4,000 years, it has stood against time itself. Through storms, shifting empires, and endless erosion, this structure remains almost unchanged, silent, massive, and deeply unsettling in its precision. And strangely, the more we study it, the less certain we become. Just imagine the world as it was 4,500 years ago. No cranes, no engines, no modern tools. And yet, over 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 80 tons, were cut, transported, and placed with astonishing accuracy. Some of these stones came from nearly 800 kilometers away, not roughly placed, but aligned so precisely that even today, a blade cannot pass between them. How was this possible? The Great Pyramid is not alone. It stands among more than 100 pyramids across Egypt, each built with a level of planning and understanding that feels far ahead of its time. These structures are not just large, they are mathematically precise. Their alignment with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, is nearly perfect. But perhaps even more mysterious is their connection to the sky. Ancient builders seem to understand celestial patterns with incredible accuracy. Solar equinoxes, star alignments, and even proportions that resemble the shape and scale of the Earth itself appear embedded in the design. Today, we rely on satellites to calculate such measurements. But thousands of years ago, how did they know? Was this simply trial and error, or something more? Before we begin, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's slowly drift back. Over 4,000 years, we begin with something that feels almost unreal. A structure that should not exist, at least not in the time it was built. Out in the Egyptian desert, just beyond the modern city of Cairo, the Great Pyramid rises slowly from the sand. Not suddenly, not sharply, but with a quiet heaviness, like something that has always been there. It does not feel built, it feels placed. For over 4,500 years it has stood in silence, through storms, through shifting empires, through the slow wearing down of time itself. It remains, not perfect, but close enough to make you pause. At first glance it looks simple, just a massive stone pyramid, 4 sides, a pointed top, nothing overly complex. But the longer you look, the stranger it becomes, because this is not just a pile of stones. It is made from more than 2 million individual blocks, each one weighing anywhere between 2 tons and sometimes as much as 80 tons. And yet, these stones are not loosely stacked. They are fitted together so precisely that even today, you cannot slide a blade between many of them. And this is where the question begins to settle in. Slowly, quietly. How? Not just how were they lifted, but how were they shaped so perfectly, without modern tools? Because 4,500 years ago, there were no cranes, no steel machines, no advanced cutting tools. The wheel itself was not even widely used for heavy transport in Egypt at that time. And still, this structure was completed. It is easy, at first, to assume that it must have taken centuries, that perhaps thousands of generations slowly built it piece by piece. But evidence suggests something even more surprising. It may have been built in just 20 years. 20 years. To move, shape, and place over 2 million stones. If you pause for a moment and imagine that, it becomes difficult to hold on to the idea. Even today, with all our technology, organizing a project of that scale would be overwhelming. And yet, it was done. But the mystery does not end there. The stones themselves were not all taken from nearby. Some of the granite used inside the pyramid came from over 800 kilometers away. transported across land, or perhaps water, without engines, without modern roads, and without any clear explanation of how such weight could be moved so consistently. And then there is the alignment. The pyramid is positioned almost perfectly with the four cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. The accuracy is so precise that even small modern errors would exceed it, and this was done without compasses, without satellites, without any of the tools we rely on today. So how did they find true north with such perfection? Some believe they used the stars, others suggest shadows or the movement of the sun, but none of these explanations fully account for the level of precision achieved. It feels intentional, and then something even more subtle. From most angles, the pyramid appears to have 4 sides, but in reality, it has 8. Each face is slightly indented down the center, creating a shape that is almost impossible to notice unless the light hits it just right. This effect becomes visible during the solar equinox, when the sun casts shadows in a way that reveals the hidden geometry, which raises another quiet question. Was this intentional too? Because if it was, it suggests that the builders were not only thinking about structure, but about light, about time, about the movement of the sun itself. And slowly, the pyramid begins to feel less like a tomb and more like something else entirely. Originally, the pyramid did not look like it does today. It was once covered in smooth, polished white limestone, so reflective that it would shine brightly under the desert sun. Some say it looked like a glowing jewel, visible from miles away. At the very top, there may have been a capstone, possibly made of gold. Imagine that for a moment. A massive gleaming structure, reflecting sunlight across the desert, perfectly aligned with the earth, and possibly connected to the sky. And then, time passed. The outer stones were removed, the shine faded, the sharp edges softened. What remains now is only the core, the inner skeleton of something that once felt almost alive with light. But even in this reduced state, it still holds its presence, still holds its silence, and still holds its questions. Because when you stand before it, or even just imagine it clearly, one feeling continues to return. This should not exist. Not here, not then, not in the way it does. And that feeling, that quiet sense that something doesn't fully add up, is where the mystery truly begins. We leave behind a structure that feels almost impossible, to a world that on the surface should never have been able to create it. To understand the Great Pyramid, or any monument like it, we have to step away from the image we carry of the modern world, with its machines, its engines, its systems that quietly handle weight, distance, and precision for us. We have to go back to a time that feels slower, quieter, and far more limited, at least at first glance. Around 4,500 years ago, during the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the world was not empty or primitive, but it was fundamentally different in the tools it relied on and the methods it used. There were no cranes lifting massive stones into place, no steel blades slicing clean edges, no engines transporting materials across long distances. The materials available were simple, and the tools were shaped by what could be found, refined, and understood through direct experience. Metals like iron were not yet in common use, and instead, the people of that time relied heavily on copper, a softer metal that required careful handling, often strengthened slightly by combining it with other elements like arsenic. With these tools, they carved, cut, and shaped stone, not quickly, not effortlessly, but through repeated motion, patience, and a deep familiarity with the materials they were working with. It is easy to underestimate what can be achieved with simple tools, but when those tools are used with consistency, with skill passed down through generations, they become extensions of knowledge rather than limitations. Alongside copper, stone itself was used as a tool, particularly harder stones like dolerite, which could be used to pound and shape granite, one of the hardest materials employed in the pyramid's inner chambers. The process was not about slicing cleanly through rock, but about gradually breaking it down, striking repeatedly in controlled ways until the desired shape emerged. This kind of work would have been slow, methodical, and physically demanding, requiring not only strength, but precision, an understanding of where to strike, how much force to apply, and how the material would respond. Wood was another essential resource, used to create levers, sledges, and simple frameworks that could assist in moving heavy objects. Without wheels designed for such weight, transportation relied on dragging stones across the ground, often on wooden sledges, where friction became one of the greatest challenges. But even here, solutions were found, not through complex machines, but through observation. Wetting the sand beneath a sled reduces friction significantly, making it easier to move heavy loads, a simple but effective technique that has been supported by both experimental studies and ancient visual evidence. Ropes, likely made from plant fibers, played a crucial role as well, allowing groups of workers to coordinate their effort, pulling in unison to move objects that no single individual could manage. The absence of modern machinery did not mean the absence of organization. In fact, what becomes increasingly clear is that the true strength of this world was not in its tools, but in its systems, in the way labor was structured, coordinated, and sustained over long periods of time. Large groups of workers, possibly tens of thousands, were organized into teams, each responsible for specific tasks: quarrying stone, transporting it, shaping it, placing it. These were not unskilled laborers working in chaos, but individuals who likely had defined roles, routines, and a shared understanding of the work they were doing. Evidence suggests that many of these workers were not slaves, as often imagined, but skilled laborers who were provided with food, shelter, and support, allowing them to focus on the construction process over extended periods. This level of organization requires planning, communication, and a form of management that, while different from modern systems, was no less effective in achieving its goals. Beyond physical tools, there was also a deep reliance on observation, particularly of the natural world. The movement of the sun, the patterns of stars, the flow of the Nile, all of these were not just background elements, but sources of information that could be used to guide decisions. Without compasses, direction could be determined by tracking celestial bodies, observing shadows, and noting consistent patterns over time. Geometry, though not formalized in the way we understand it today, was clearly present in practice, in the ability to create straight lines, right angles, and consistent proportions across large distances. Measuring tools may have been simple: cords, rods, marked lengths, but when used carefully and repeatedly, they allowed for a level of precision that is still evident in the structures that remain. Time itself was understood through cycles: the rising and setting of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the changing of seasons, all of which provided a framework for planning and coordination. The Nile, in particular, played a central role, not only as a source of water and sustenance, but as a transportation route, allowing materials to be moved over long distances more efficiently than by land alone. Boats, likely made from wood and reeds, would have carried heavy stones along the river, reducing the need for overland transport and connecting distant quarries to construction sites. This integration of natural systems into human activity reflects a way of working that is less about overcoming the environment and more about working within it, using its patterns and resources to support large-scale projects. Writing, though not widespread in the way it would later become, was present in the form of hieroglyphs, allowing for the recording of information, instructions, and possibly plans, though much of the detailed knowledge may have been transmitted orally through teaching and demonstration rather than written manuals. This kind of knowledge transfer creates continuity, but also fragility, as it depends on the preservation of tradition and the presence of those who carry it forward. What emerges from this picture is not a world without capability, but a world that approaches problems differently, relying less on mechanical force and more on coordination, observation, and incremental progress. The absence of machines does not mean the absence of ingenuity. In many ways, it highlights it. Because without the shortcuts provided by technology, every solution must be discovered, tested, and refined through direct interaction with materials and environment. This leads to methods that may appear simple, but are often the result of deep understanding, of knowing how much weight can be moved, how materials behave under pressure, how small adjustments can lead to significant changes in outcome. When we place the Great Pyramid within this context, it does not become less impressive, but more so because it represents the culmination of these methods, applied at a scale that pushes them to their limits. It suggests that the people of that time were not constrained by their lack of machines, but adapted to it, developing systems that allowed them to achieve results that continue to challenge our assumptions. And yet, even with all of this considered, there remains a gap, a space between what we can explain and what we can fully understand. The tools are known, the materials are identified, the methods are hypothesized, but the complete picture, the exact sequence of decisions, adjustments, and techniques that led to the final structure is still not entirely clear. It is in this space that the mystery persists, not as something supernatural, but as something incomplete, a reminder that knowledge can exist without being fully recorded, that skill can be present without leaving behind a detailed explanation. As we move forward, deeper into the process, into the movement of stones, the shaping of materials, and the placement of each piece, we carry this understanding with us, that this was a world without machines, but not without intelligence, not without structure, and certainly not without the ability to create something that would endure far beyond its own time. We leave behind a world without machines, to the question that feels even heavier than the stones themselves. Because understanding the tools is only the beginning. The real challenge is movement. Not one stone, not 10, but over 2 million blocks, each shaped, lifted, and placed with intention. When you stand before the idea of it, the scale becomes difficult to hold in your mind. It is not just construction, it is coordination on a level that feels almost overwhelming. The Great Pyramid was not built in a single moment, but through a continuous flow of effort, a system that had to remain stable, organized, and efficient for years without interruption. Every stone that reached its place at the top began its journey far away, in a quarry still embedded in the earth, waiting to be separated, shaped, and moved across distance. The process likely began along the edges of limestone quarries near the construction site, where workers would cut channels into the rock using copper tools, wooden wedges, and repeated strikes. Once a block was outlined, wooden wedges could be inserted into cracks and soaked with water, expanding slowly until the stone separated from the bedrock. It was not a sudden break, but a controlled release, guided by patience and understanding of the material. From there, the stone would be shaped roughly, not perfectly finished, but prepared enough to be transported without unnecessary weight. And then came the moment where effort shifted from cutting to moving. Without wheels capable of handling such mass, the primary method appears to have been dragging. Large wooden sledges were placed beneath the stones, creating a platform that could slide across the ground. Teams of workers would pull these sledges using thick ropes, their movements coordinated, their steps aligned, turning individual strength into collective force. But dragging something so heavy across dry sand would create immense resistance, slowing progress to a near halt. This is where a small, almost simple detail changes everything. By adding water to the sand ahead of the sledges, friction is reduced significantly. The grains bind together just enough to create a smoother surface, allowing the weight to glide rather than sink. Ancient wall reliefs show workers pouring liquid in front of moving stones, a quiet hint that they understood this principle through observation and experience. It is a reminder that not all solutions come from complex inventions. Sometimes they come from noticing how the world responds to small changes. Once the stones began moving, the challenge became one of consistency. A single successful transport is not enough when the task must be repeated thousands, even millions of times. Paths would have needed to be prepared, cleared, and maintained, possibly reinforced with mud, limestone chips, or wooden planks to create stable routes. Over time, these paths may have become worn into the landscape, guiding the movement of each new stone along familiar lines. And then there is the distance. While many stones came from nearby quarries, others traveled much farther. The granite used for internal chambers came from Aswan, hundreds of kilometers to the south. Moving such material across land alone would have been extremely difficult, which is why the Nile likely played a central role in transportation. During certain seasons, when the river flooded, it expanded across the surrounding land, creating temporary waterways that extended closer to the construction site. Stones could be loaded onto boats or barges, floated downstream, and brought much closer to their final destination than would be possible by land. This seasonal rhythm turned the river into a moving road, one that required timing, planning, and an understanding of natural cycles. When the waters receded, the stones would be unloaded and dragged the remaining distance, completing a journey that combined both water and land. But reaching the base of the pyramid was only part of the challenge. The true difficulty begins when the stones must be lifted upward. As the structure rose, each layer required stones to be placed higher than the last, creating a vertical problem that is far more complex than horizontal movement. Several theories attempt to explain how this was achieved. One of the most widely discussed involves ramps, long sloping pathways built from mud brick, limestone, or debris, extending from the ground up along the sides of the pyramid. These ramps would allow sledges to be pulled upward gradually, reducing the need for lifting in a single motion. As the pyramid grew taller, the ramps would be extended, adjusted, or even wrapped around the structure in a spiraling path. However, the size of such ramps would have been enormous, potentially requiring as much material as the pyramid itself, raising questions about their practicality. Other ideas suggest more compact ramp systems, possibly internal ramps built within the pyramid structure, hidden from view, allowing stones to be moved upward through a controlled internal pathway. While evidence for such systems remains debated, the concept reflects an important point, that the solution may not have been singular. It is possible that different methods were used at different stages, adapting to the height, the angle, and the specific challenges of each phase. Levers may have played a role as well, using wooden beams to lift stones incrementally, raising them step by step rather than all at once. This approach, while slow, allows heavy objects to be moved upward with limited force, relying on repetition and control rather than brute strength. When combined with ramps or platforms, it could create a system where stones are gradually elevated into place, each movement small, but part of a larger progression. Throughout all of this, coordination remains the invisible force holding everything together. Moving one stone is a task. Moving millions requires a system that can sustain effort over time without collapsing into disorder. Workers would need to be organized into teams, each with a specific role: pulling, guiding, preparing surfaces, managing ropes, ensuring alignment. Communication, even without modern language systems, would have been essential. Signals, rhythms, shared timing that allowed large groups to act as one. Food, water, rest, all had to be managed, creating a support system that extended beyond the construction itself. This was not just labor, it was an operation, one that required planning on a scale that matched the structure being built. And yet, despite all the theories, all the experiments, all the reconstructions, there is still a sense that something is missing. The methods we describe are possible, they can be demonstrated in smaller forms, but scaling them to the level required for the Great Pyramid introduces uncertainties, inefficiencies, and questions that do not always resolve cleanly. The precision with which stones were placed, the consistency of the work, the speed at which it may have been completed, all suggest a level of refinement that goes beyond basic trial and error. It does not feel like a process that was being figured out as it went along. It feels practiced, understood, as if the builders were working within a system they already trusted. Perhaps that system developed over time, refined through earlier projects, smaller structures that allowed techniques to be tested and improved. Or perhaps there were elements of knowledge that have not been fully preserved, details that were never written down, methods passed through hands rather than recorded in words. As we follow the journey of each stone, from quarry to river, from sled to ramp, from ground to summit, we begin to see not just movement, but intention, a sequence of actions that, when combined, create something far greater than the sum of its parts. It is easy to focus on the weight, the difficulty, the physical challenge, but what stands out more clearly is the consistency, the ability to repeat complex actions over and over again without losing accuracy. That is what turns effort into achievement. That is what allows something impossible to slowly become real. And as the pyramid rises, layer by layer, stone by stone, the question remains, not just how they moved the mountains, but how they did it with such quiet precision, leaving behind a result that still feels, even now, just beyond explanation. We leave behind the weight of moving mountains to something far quieter, and in many ways, far more unsettling. Because once the stones arrive, once they are lifted into place, another question begins to take shape, not about strength, but about precision, not about how much, but how exact. When you look closely at the Great Pyramid, what stands out is not only its size, but its accuracy, an accuracy that feels almost out of place in a world without modern instruments. The base of the pyramid forms a near-perfect square, each side almost identical in length, differing by only a matter of centimeters across hundreds of meters. This is not an approximation. It is intention carried out with consistency, a level of control that suggests more than simple measurement, more than rough estimation. It suggests a system that could repeat accuracy again and again, across distance, across time, without drifting away from its original plan. And then there is its orientation. The pyramid is aligned with the cardinal directions so precisely that even today, with advanced tools, achieving the same level of accuracy requires careful calibration. True north, not magnetic north, but the actual axis of the Earth, is reflected in the positioning of its sides with almost no error. This is not something that can be guessed. It requires observation, patience, and a method that can translate the movement of the sky into fixed points on the ground. One possible explanation lies in the stars, particularly the circumpolar stars that never set, rotating around a fixed point in the sky. By tracking their movement and finding the center of that rotation, it is possible to determine true north with remarkable precision. But even with this knowledge, the process would require repeated observations, adjustments, and a stable reference system to transfer that alignment onto the ground in a way that remains consistent during construction. It is not a single moment of accuracy, but a sustained one, maintained as the structure rises layer by layer. The geometry of the pyramid adds another layer to this quiet complexity. The angles of its sides are not arbitrary, but consistent, creating a smooth incline that meets at a single apex. Maintaining this angle across such a large structure requires not only measurement, but verification, a way to check that each new layer remains true to the original design. Without modern levels or laser tools, this would have been achieved through simpler instruments, plumb lines, leveling tools using water, straight edges, cords stretched tight between points. These are basic in form, but when used carefully, they can produce results of extraordinary accuracy. What matters is not the complexity of the tool, but the discipline of its use, the consistency with which it is applied, and the understanding of how small errors can accumulate if not corrected early. In the case of the pyramid, those errors appear to have been minimized to an extent that still surprises modern engineers. The joints between stones reflect this same attention to detail. While the outer casing stones, now mostly gone, were polished to a smooth finish, even the inner blocks show a level of fitting that goes beyond what is strictly necessary for stability. The surfaces meet closely, reducing gaps, distributing weight evenly, and creating a structure that behaves as a single mass rather than a loose assembly of parts. This kind of fitting requires not only careful shaping of individual stones, but an understanding of how they interact when placed together, how pressure moves through the structure, how alignment affects stability over time. It is a form of knowledge that is both practical and intuitive, developed through experience, refined through repetition. And then there is something even more subtle, something that is easy to miss unless the light falls in just the right way. The pyramid, which appears to have 4 flat sides, is actually slightly concave on each face, creating the effect of 8 sides instead of 4. This indentation is so slight that it is invisible under most conditions, but becomes apparent during specific lighting, particularly around the equinox, when the sun casts shadows that reveal the hidden geometry. Whether this was intentional or a result of construction techniques is still debated, but its presence adds another layer to the sense that this structure was not only built for function, but with an awareness of how it would interact with light, with time, with the movement of the sun across the sky. The proportions of the pyramid have also drawn attention, particularly the relationship between its height and the perimeter of its base. Some interpretations suggest that this ratio reflects the proportions of a circle relating to what we now understand as the value of p, while others caution that such connections may be coincidental or the result of interpreting the structure through modern mathematical frameworks. What remains clear, however, is that the builders were working with consistent ratios, with a sense of proportion that guided the overall form, even if the exact mathematical reasoning behind it is not fully known. This sense of proportion extends beyond the pyramid itself to its placement within the landscape. The Giza plateau was not chosen randomly, but selected and prepared, leveled to create a stable foundation. Achieving a level base across such a large area requires careful surveying, the ability to identify high and low points, to remove or fill material, to create a surface that does not shift or settle unevenly under the immense weight of the structure. One method that may have been used involves water, creating shallow trenches filled with water to establish a consistent horizontal reference, allowing builders to mark a level plane across the site. This approach, simple in concept, can produce highly accurate results when applied carefully, again demonstrating that precision does not always require complex tools, but careful application of basic principles. As the pyramid rose, maintaining this precision would have required constant checking, adjusting, and correcting. Each layer builds upon the one below it, meaning that any small error, if left uncorrected, would grow larger over time. The fact that the final structure remains so accurate suggests that these corrections were made continuously, that the builders were not only following a plan, but actively monitoring their work, comparing it against expected outcomes, and making adjustments as needed. This level of control implies not just skill, but a system, a way of organizing work that allows for feedback, for verification, for maintaining standards over long periods. It also suggests a shared understanding among those involved, a common reference that ensures consistency even as different teams work on different parts of the structure. When all of these elements are considered together, the alignment, the geometry, the fitting of stones, the leveling of the base, the consistency of proportions, the pyramid begins to feel less like a static object and more like the result of a process that was deeply understood by those who carried it out. And yet, despite this understanding, there remains a sense that something about it extends beyond what we can fully reconstruct. The methods we describe are plausible, they can explain individual aspects, but bringing them all together at this scale, with this level of accuracy, still leaves room for questions. It is not that the builders had access to unknown technology, but that their approach, their combination of observation, measurement, and practice, may have reached a level that we do not always expect from the time in which they lived. It challenges the assumption that precision is a modern achievement, showing instead that it can emerge wherever there is attention, discipline, and deep engagement with the world. As we stand within this understanding, looking at the pyramid not just as a monument, but as a product of precise decisions carried out over years, the mystery shifts again, becoming quieter, more focused. It is no longer just about how something so large was built, but how something so exact was maintained throughout its creation. And in that quiet shift, the pyramid reveals another layer of its presence, not only as a structure that endures, but as one that continues to ask, in its stillness, how such precision was achieved, and why it mattered so much to those who built it. We leave behind lines drawn with impossible precision to the quiet darkness hidden inside them, because what we see on the outside, as vast and exact as it is only part of the story. The Great Pyramid is not solid. It is not just a mountain of stone. Within it, there is space, carefully carved, deliberately placed, and arranged in ways that feel almost as intentional as the structure itself. And yet, for all the centuries of exploration, what lies inside still feels incomplete, as if the pyramid is holding something back. When early explorers first entered the structure, they did not find open halls or grand chambers waiting to be discovered. They found narrow passages, tight corridors, spaces that forced the body to bend, to slow down, to move carefully. The main entrance that is used today was not even the original one. It was created later, cutting into the pyramid's outer layers. The original entrance lies higher up, aligned with the northern face, leading into a descending passage that slopes downward into the darkness. This passage is narrow, confined, almost uncomfortable, and it leads deep beneath the pyramid into a chamber carved into the bedrock below. This underground chamber feels unfinished, rough, almost abandoned, as if the plan changed midway through construction. Its purpose is still uncertain. Some believe it was an early attempt at a burial chamber, later replaced by the ones above. Others see it as something symbolic, a connection to the underworld, a representation of a journey that begins beneath the earth before rising upward. But the pyramid does not end below. As you move back through the descending passage, another path branches upward, leading into what is known as the ascending passage. This shift from downward to upward feels deliberate, almost narrative, as if the movement itself is part of the design. The ascending passage leads into one of the most striking spaces inside the pyramid, the Grand Gallery. This corridor is unlike anything else in the structure. It rises sharply, its walls stepping inward as they climb, creating a tall, narrow space that feels both confined and expansive at the same time. The precision of its construction is immediately noticeable. The stones are arranged in a way that reduces pressure on the space below, distributing weight outward, allowing the corridor to exist without collapsing under the immense mass above it. But beyond its structural purpose, the Grand Gallery carries a sense of intention that is harder to define. Its height, its slope, its proportions all feel designed to create an experience, not just a passage from one point to another. At the top of this gallery lies a horizontal corridor that leads into what is often called the Queen's Chamber. Despite its name, there is no clear evidence that it was ever used for a queen. It sits at the center of the pyramid, aligned along its vertical axis, and its walls are smooth, carefully finished. The chamber itself is simple, almost understated, but what makes it unusual are the small shafts, that extend from its walls. These shafts do not reach the outside. They stop partway, sealed, as if they were never completed, or perhaps never intended to open. Their purpose remains unclear. Some suggest they were symbolic pathways for the soul. Others believe they may have had a structural or ventilation function, though their sealed ends challenge that idea. Continuing upward from the Grand Gallery, the path leads to the King's Chamber, the most well-known space within the pyramid. This chamber is built entirely from massive granite blocks, far heavier and harder than the limestone used in most of the structure. The precision here is even more striking. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all are formed from carefully shaped blocks that fit together with minimal gaps. At the center of the chamber lies a large stone box, often referred to as a sarcophagus, though it was found empty. No lid, no remains, no treasures. Just the box itself, placed within a space that feels final, yet incomplete. Above the king's chamber lies a series of narrow spaces known as relieving chambers. These are stacked one above the other, separated by massive stone slabs designed to redirect the immense weight of the pyramid away from the chamber below. Without them, the ceiling would collapse under pressure. Their existence shows a clear understanding of structural forces, an awareness of how weight moves and how it can be managed. But even here, in these hidden spaces, there are markings, red symbols painted on the stones, possibly left by workers during construction. These marks are not decorative. They feel functional, like notes, labels, reminders of a process that once took place but is no longer visible. And then there are the shafts that extend from the king's chamber, narrow channels that angle upward and outward, eventually reaching the exterior of the pyramid. Unlike the shafts in the queen's chamber, these are open, connecting the inner space to the outside world. Their alignment has drawn attention, as they appear to point toward specific stars, particularly those associated with ancient Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife. Whether this was intentional or coincidental is still debated, but the precision of their angles suggests that they were not placed randomly. They may have served as symbolic pathways, channels through which the spirit could travel, connecting the interior of the pyramid to the sky. Despite all of this, the pyramid still feels incomplete, not in its construction, but in our understanding of it. Modern technology has begun to reveal hints of what may still be hidden. Techniques that can detect differences in density within the structure have identified voids, spaces that are not yet accessible, areas that have not been explored directly. One such void lies above the Grand Gallery, a large empty space whose purpose is unknown. It does not connect clearly to any known passage. It is simply there, silent, sealed, waiting. The existence of such spaces raises the possibility that there are more chambers, more corridors, more elements of the design that remain undiscovered. Over the years, small robotic devices have been sent into the narrow shafts, navigating spaces too tight for humans to enter. These explorations have revealed blocked passages, small doors, and surfaces that appear deliberately sealed. In some cases, markings have been found, symbols that have not been fully interpreted, adding another layer to the mystery. Each new discovery answers one question, but opens several more. The deeper we look, the more the pyramid seems to resist being fully understood. It is not just a structure with hidden rooms. It is a system, one that combines space, direction, and sequence in a way that feels intentional, yet not entirely explained. Moving through it, even in imagination, feels less like exploring a building and more like following a path, one that shifts from downward to upward, from darkness to light, from narrow passages to larger chambers. Whether this was meant to represent a journey, a transition, or something else entirely is still uncertain. What is clear is that the interior was not designed randomly. Every passage, every chamber, every shaft appears to have a place, a role within a larger design. And yet, that design is only partially visible to us. There are gaps, missing connections, unanswered questions that remain even after centuries of study. The pyramid does not reveal everything at once. It offers fragments, glimpses, pieces that suggest a deeper structure beneath what we can see. As we stand at the edge of what is known, looking into these spaces that have been explored and those that have not, there is a quiet realization that begins to settle in. The Great Pyramid is not just something that was built and then left behind. It is something that still holds its secrets, not because they are impossible to uncover, but because they are layered, hidden within a design that was never meant to be fully obvious. And in that quiet, enclosed darkness, surrounded by stone that has remained unchanged for thousands of years, the question lingers once again, not loudly, but steadily. What else is still inside, waiting to be found? We leave behind hidden chambers and silent corridors, to a discovery that feels almost impossible to accept. Because after everything the pyramid contains, after all the precision, the effort, the planning, the expectation that something of great importance must lie at its center, the final reveal is not what anyone imagined. When explorers reach the innermost chamber, the space that should have held the greatest secret of all, they found nothing. No preserved body, no golden treasures, no elaborate burial, only an empty stone box, resting in a room that felt prepared for something that was no longer there. At first, the explanation seemed simple. The pyramid was built as a tomb, and like many tombs throughout history, it was looted. Over thousands of years, countless structures have been broken into, stripped of valuables, and left hollow by those seeking wealth. It is entirely possible that the Great Pyramid suffered the same fate, that its entrance was discovered, its contents removed, and its purpose reduced to an empty shell. But as with many aspects of the pyramid, the closer we look, the less certain this explanation becomes. Unlike many other tombs, there is very little direct evidence of forced entry in the earliest periods. The internal layout is complex, with passages that are narrow, concealed, and in some cases blocked. If looters had entered, they would have needed knowledge, time, and access that is not easily explained. And even if they had succeeded, it is difficult to imagine that they removed everything so completely, leaving behind no fragments, no overlooked objects, no traces of what was once there. In other burial sites across Egypt, even those that were looted, some evidence always remains. Small items, broken pieces, inscriptions, signs that something was taken. But here, the absence feels too complete, too clean, as if the chamber was never filled in the way we expect. This leads to another possibility, one that shifts the question rather than answering it. What if the pyramid was never used as a tomb in the first place? This idea challenges one of the most widely accepted beliefs about the structure, but it is not without reason. There are no detailed burial texts inside the Great Pyramid, unlike later pyramids where walls are covered in inscriptions describing the journey of the soul. There are no decorations, no scenes, no carvings that clearly define its purpose as a resting place. The interior is stark, almost minimal, focused more on form than on storytelling. If this was meant to be a tomb, it is a very different kind of tomb, one that does not follow the patterns seen elsewhere. Some have suggested that the burial may have taken place and was later removed, either by looters or by those who came after, perhaps even relocated for protection. But this idea introduces its own questions. Why would such a significant burial be moved? And why is there no clear record of such an event? The further we move from the initial assumption, the more the pyramid begins to feel like something that does not fit easily into a single explanation. The empty sarcophagus itself adds to this sense of uncertainty. It is not ornate. It carries no inscriptions that clearly identify its occupant. It is simply there, positioned within the chamber, aligned with the space, but offering no direct answers. Its size suggests it was meant to hold something, yet what it held, if anything, remains unknown. It is as if the chamber was prepared for a purpose that was either never fulfilled or never meant to be obvious. There is also the possibility that the pyramid served multiple purposes, that it was both a tomb and something more, a structure that combined function with symbolism in ways that are not immediately clear. In ancient Egyptian belief, death was not an end, but a transition, a movement from one state of existence to another. The physical body was important, but so was the journey of the soul, its passage through different realms, its connection to the stars, to the sun, to forces that were not confined to the earth. If the pyramid was designed to reflect this journey, then its interior may represent stages rather than storage, pathways rather than containers. In this context, the absence of a body becomes less about loss and more about intention. It suggests that the most important element was not something to be placed inside, but something to move through, an idea, a process, a transformation that does not leave behind physical traces. This perspective does not eliminate the mystery, but it changes its shape. It shifts the focus from what is missing to what may have been meant to happen within the space. The ascending and descending passages, the transition from lower to higher chambers, the alignment of shafts toward the sky, all begin to feel connected, not as random features, but as parts of a sequence. Whether this sequence was symbolic, ceremonial, or something else entirely is still uncertain, but it introduces the idea that the pyramid's purpose may not be fully captured by the word tomb. At the same time, we cannot ignore the simpler explanations. Time itself has a way of removing evidence, of erasing details, of leaving behind only what can endure. Organic materials decay, metals are taken, reused, melted down. Objects that once filled a space can disappear completely, leaving behind only the structure that held them. Over thousands of years, even significant traces can be lost, especially in a place that has been entered, explored, and altered by countless hands. The pyramid we see today is not exactly as it was when it was first sealed. It has been opened, studied, modified, its surfaces touched, its passages cleared, its stones removed in places. Each of these actions changes the context, making it harder to distinguish between what was original and what was altered. And yet, even with this understanding, the emptiness remains striking. It is not just the absence of objects, but the absence of clear answers. The pyramid offers space, structure, alignment, but not explanation. It invites interpretation, but does not confirm it. It allows for multiple possibilities to exist at the same time, none of them fully complete. As we stand within this uncertainty, the question becomes quieter, less about what was taken and more about what was intended. If this was a tomb, it is unlike any other. If it was something else, that purpose has not been fully revealed. Perhaps it was both, or perhaps it was part of a system that extended beyond the pyramid itself, connected to other structures, to the landscape, to beliefs that were understood at the time, but are now only partially visible to us. What remains undeniable is the feeling that the central chamber, the place that should have held the answer, instead holds a question, a space prepared with care, built with precision, yet left empty in a way that feels deliberate, or at least unresolved. And as we move forward, carrying that emptiness with us, the pyramid continues to shift in meaning, becoming less of a final resting place, and more of a mystery that was never fully meant to be solved. We leave behind an empty chamber that should have held a king, to a belief system that tried to outlive death itself. To understand the pyramid, we have to step into the mindset of those who built it, into a world where death was not feared in the way we often imagine, but studied, prepared for, and even designed around. For the ancient Egyptians, life did not end at the final breath. It continued, shifted, transformed into another state that required as much structure and care as the world of the living. This belief was not abstract. It shaped everything, from daily rituals to the largest constructions ever attempted. The idea of immortality was not a distant hope. It was a goal that could be prepared for, planned, and secured through the right actions, the right knowledge, and the right environment. At the center of this belief was the understanding that a human being was not made of a single part, but of multiple elements, each with its own role in both life and death. There was the physical body, which needed to be preserved, protected from decay, maintained as a recognizable form. There was the ka, often described as a life force or spiritual double, which remained connected to the body and required nourishment, offerings, and a place to reside. There was the be, a more mobile aspect of the self, capable of moving between worlds, often represented as a bird with a human head. And there was the ak, a transformed state achieved after death, a kind of perfected existence that could join the realm of the gods. These were not just ideas. They were parts of a system that required careful balance. If any part was neglected, the journey after death could be disrupted. This is why preservation became so important. The process of mummification was not simply about honoring the dead. It was about maintaining the structure that allowed the other elements to function. Organs were removed, treated, and stored. The body was dried, wrapped, protected with layers of linen and resin. Every step was intentional, guided by knowledge that had been refined over generations. The goal was not to create a lifelike appearance, but to preserve identity, to ensure that the body remained a stable point of reference for the soul. Alongside this physical preparation, there was also a spiritual journey that had to be navigated. After death, the soul was believed to pass through a series of trials, moving through a landscape that was both familiar and unknown. One of the most important moments in this journey was the weighing of the heart, a symbolic test where the heart of the deceased was placed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, representing truth and balance. If the heart was lighter or equal, the soul could continue, moving toward immortality. If it was heavier, weighed down by wrongdoing, it would be consumed, ending the journey. This idea placed responsibility on the individual, suggesting that life itself was a preparation for what came after. But even with this moral dimension, the physical environment of the afterlife still needed to be constructed. This is where tombs, temples, and eventually pyramids became essential. They were not simply places to store a body. They were designed as gateways, as transitional spaces that connected the world of the living to the world beyond. Offerings of food, drink, tools, and treasures were placed inside to sustain the ka, ensuring that it would not weaken. Walls were sometimes decorated with scenes of daily life, providing a kind of continuity, a reminder of what existed before and what could exist again. In earlier periods, tombs were relatively simple, rectangular structures known as mastabas, built low to the ground, with a hidden chamber beneath. But over time, these forms evolved, becoming more complex, more vertical, reaching upward rather than remaining flat. The step pyramid of Djoser marked a turning point, stacking layers of mastabas to create a structure that began to suggest ascent, movement from earth toward sky. This idea would eventually be refined into the smooth-sided pyramids, where the transition became continuous, uninterrupted, a single form rising toward a point. The pyramid itself can be seen as a symbol of this journey. Its base, wide and stable, represents the world of the living, grounded, connected to the earth. Its peak, narrow and elevated, reaches toward the sky, toward the realm of the gods. The sloping sides create a path, not one that can be physically walked, but one that can be imagined, a direction of movement from one state to another. The alignment of the pyramid with the cardinal directions reinforces this connection, anchoring it within the structure of the world, while the shafts that extend from its chambers toward the sky suggest pathways beyond it. Some of these shafts appear to point toward specific stars, particularly those associated with eternal cycles, stars that never set, always visible, always present. For the ancient Egyptians, these stars represented permanence, a form of immortality. that could be mirrored in the journey of the soul. The king, as a divine figure, was believed to join these stars, to become part of a cosmic order that extended beyond the limitations of human life. This belief adds another layer to the construction of the pyramid. It was not only about preserving the body or storing goods. It was about creating a structure that aligned with the universe itself, that positioned the king within a larger system, connecting earth, sky, and the space in between. The precision we see in its alignment and proportions may reflect this intention, ensuring that the structure was not only stable, but correctly oriented within a cosmic framework. Rituals played a key role in activating this system. Ceremonies were performed before and after death, including the opening of the mouth ritual, which symbolically restored the senses of the deceased, allowing them to see, speak, and breathe in the afterlife. Priests, acting as intermediaries, carried out these rituals, maintaining the connection between the living and the dead. The tomb was not a sealed space in the sense of being forgotten. It was part of an ongoing relationship, one that required attention, offerings, and remembrance. Over time, however, these practices evolved. Later pyramids included extensive inscriptions, known as pyramid texts, carved into the walls, providing guidance for the soul, spells, instructions, and protections that would assist in the journey beyond death. The absence of such texts in the Great Pyramid raises questions, suggesting that either the practices were different at the time, or that the purpose of the structure extended beyond what we now associate with burial. Still, the central idea remains consistent. Death was not an end. It was a transition that required preparation, structure, and alignment. The pyramid, in this context, becomes more than a tomb. It becomes a tool, a device designed to facilitate this transition, to ensure that the journey continues smoothly, that nothing is left to chance. As we consider this belief system, the emptiness of the central chamber begins to feel different. It is no longer just an absence of objects, but a reflection of a deeper focus, one that places less importance on what remains physically and more on what moves beyond it. The pyramid does not simply hold the dead, it directs them. It positions them within a system that extends beyond the visible world. And yet, despite all of this structure, all of this preparation, the outcome remains uncertain. The journey after death, though carefully mapped, was still unknown, still something that could not be fully controlled. This tension between preparation and uncertainty may be part of what gives the pyramid its lasting presence. It stands as a response to a question that has no final answer, a structure built not to eliminate mystery, but to navigate it. And as we move forward, carrying this understanding with us, the pyramid becomes not just a monument to death, but to the desire to continue, to persist, to reach beyond the limits of a single life into something that feels eternal. We leave behind a world built for the afterlife, to a possibility that feels far less certain and far more unsettling, because once the idea of the pyramid as a tomb begins to loosen, even slightly, another question begins to take its place, not as a replacement, but as a quiet alternative that refuses to disappear. What if the pyramid had another purpose, one that was never fully recorded, or perhaps never meant to be obvious? This is where the discussion moves beyond accepted explanations and into a space where theory, observation, and speculation begin to overlap. It is a space that must be approached carefully, not as a claim of certainty, but as an exploration of patterns that are difficult to ignore. Among these ideas, one of the most persistent is the suggestion that the pyramid functioned in some way as an energy system, not in the modern sense of wires and circuits, but as a structure that interacted with natural forces, amplifying, directing, or harnessing them in ways that are not immediately visible. At first, this idea feels distant, even unlikely, but when we look closely at certain details, it begins to take on a different shape, not as a complete explanation, but as a possibility that raises its own set of questions. The materials used within the pyramid are not random. While much of the structure is built from limestone, the internal chambers, particularly the king's chamber, are constructed from granite, a material that contains a high concentration of quartz. Quartz has a property known as piezoelectricity, meaning that it can generate an electrical charge when subjected to pressure or mechanical stress. In the case of the pyramid, the weight pressing down on these granite blocks is immense, millions of tons distributed across the structure, creating a constant force that could, in theory, interact with the material in measurable ways. On its own, this does not prove that the pyramid was generating or transmitting energy, but it introduces a characteristic that is at least worth noting. It suggests that the builders were working with materials that have properties beyond simple strength, whether or not they fully understood those properties in the way we describe them today. The design of the pyramid also invites further observation. Its shape, a broad base narrowing to a single point, is inherently stable, but it also directs attention upward, focusing energy, movement, or even symbolic meaning toward its apex. The original outer casing, made of highly polished white limestone, would have reflected sunlight intensely, creating a surface that interacted with light in a way that is no longer visible today. At the very top, there may have been a capstone, possibly made of metal, perhaps gold, which is an excellent conductor. While there is no definitive evidence that this capstone functioned in an electrical sense, its placement at the highest point of such a precisely constructed structure raises questions about whether it served more than a decorative purpose. Some interpretations suggest that the pyramid's placement within the landscape may also be significant. It sits on a limestone plateau, a material that can conduct certain types of vibrations, and it is positioned near the Nile, a flowing body of water that may have influenced the surrounding environment in subtle ways. The idea here is not that the pyramid was a machine in the modern sense, but that it may have been part of a system interacting with natural elements like water, earth, and possibly even atmospheric conditions. This line of thought becomes more prominent when considering the work of individuals who have explored alternative interpretations of ancient structures. One such perspective suggests that the pyramid could have functioned as a resonant chamber, a space where vibrations, whether acoustic, mechanical, or otherwise, could be amplified or directed. The Grand Gallery, with its unique shape and proportions, has been noted for its acoustic properties, how sound behaves within it, how it carries, reflects, and changes. While this does not confirm any specific function, it does indicate that the internal spaces of the pyramid were not only structurally significant, but also capable of interacting with sound in noticeable ways. Extending this idea further, some have proposed that the pyramid may have been designed to work with natural frequencies, aligning with the Earth's own vibrations, or with patterns that exist within the environment. This is where the theory begins to move into more speculative territory, where clear evidence becomes less defined and interpretation plays a larger role. It is important to recognize this shift, to understand that while certain observations are grounded in measurable properties, the conclusions drawn from them are not always equally supported. Still, the persistence of these ideas suggests that there is something about the pyramid that invites them, something about its design, its materials, its precision, that feels open to multiple interpretations. The interest in energy-based explanations is not limited to modern thinkers. Historical figures, including those who studied electricity and the properties of the earth itself, have considered the possibility that large structures could interact with natural forces in ways that are not immediately obvious. The idea that the earth can conduct energy, that it can be used as part of a larger system, has been explored in different contexts, though not directly linked to the pyramid in a confirmed way. What remains is a pattern of thought, a recurring question about whether ancient builders may have understood aspects of the environment that we are only beginning to explore in different forms. At the same time, there are strong reasons to approach this theory with caution. The primary evidence for the pyramid's construction points toward its role within the cultural and religious framework of ancient Egypt. The alignment, the structure, the context all fit within a system that emphasizes the afterlife, the journey of the soul, and the relationship between the earthly and the divine. Introducing an additional function, particularly one related to energy, requires evidence that directly supports that interpretation, not just observations that can be connected to it. As of now, such direct evidence remains limited. There are no inscriptions describing the pyramid as a power source, no clear mechanisms that demonstrate the generation or transmission of energy in a controlled way. This does not mean that the idea is impossible, but it does mean that it remains unconfirmed, a hypothesis rather than a conclusion. What makes this theory compelling is not necessarily its certainty, but the way it encourages us to look at the pyramid differently, to consider aspects of its design that might otherwise be overlooked, to ask questions about why certain materials were chosen, why certain shapes were used, why certain alignments were achieved with such precision. Even if the pyramid was not an energy device, the fact that it can be examined through this lens reveals something about its complexity, about the way it engages with both physical and conceptual systems. It suggests that the structure is not limited to a single interpretation, but exists at the intersection of multiple possibilities, each one offering a different perspective on what it represents. As we move through this idea, it is important to hold both curiosity and restraint, to explore without assuming, to question without concluding too quickly. The pyramid has stood for thousands of years, and in that time, it has inspired countless interpretations, some grounded, some imaginative, all reflecting the human desire to understand what lies beyond immediate explanation. Whether it was designed to harness energy, to symbolize transformation, or to serve a purpose we have not yet fully identified, one thing remains consistent. It was built with intention, with precision, and with a level of understanding that continues to challenge us. And as we stand at the edge of what can be explained and what remains uncertain, the question lingers once more, not as a statement, but as an open possibility. Could the pyramid have had another purpose? One that we are only beginning to consider? We leave behind the possibility of hidden purpose to something quieter and perhaps more grounded, yet just as unsettling. Because even if we set aside every speculative theory, even if we remain within what can be explained through materials, tools, and human effort, one question continues to return with steady persistence. How much of what they knew have we lost? Not in the sense of entire civilizations disappearing without a trace, but in smaller, more subtle ways, techniques that were practiced, refined, and passed down through generations, not written in detail, not preserved in permanent records, but carried through memory, through repetition, through hands that learn by doing rather than by reading. This kind of knowledge can be incredibly effective, but it is also fragile. It depends on continuity. It depends on people remaining in place, on traditions being maintained, on conditions staying stable enough for skills to be preserved. And when those conditions change, even slightly, the knowledge can begin to fade, not all at once, but gradually, until what remains are only the results, the structures, the artifacts, the outcomes of processes that are no longer fully understood. The Great Pyramid may be one of those results, not an isolated miracle, but the peak of a system that existed for a time and then slowly dissolved. When we look at earlier structures in Egypt, we see development, experimentation, adjustments in form and technique. The step pyramid at Saqqara shows a transition from flat structures to vertical ones. The pyramids that followed reveal changes in angle, in stability, in approach. By the time the Great Pyramid was built, the methods may have reached a level of refinement that allowed for both scale and precision to exist together. But after that point, something changes. Later pyramids become smaller, less precise, less ambitious. The knowledge does not disappear completely, but it shifts, becoming less focused on monumental construction and more on other forms of expression. This pattern suggests not a sudden loss, but a gradual transformation, where certain techniques are no longer prioritized, no longer maintained at the same level. One possible explanation lies in the nature of the techniques themselves. Many of the methods used in ancient construction were likely based on direct interaction with materials, on understanding how stone behaves under pressure, how tools wear down, how surfaces can be shaped through repeated contact. These are not abstract principles. They are learned through experience, through trial, through correction. A worker who has spent years shaping stone develops a sense of it, an intuition that is difficult to describe but highly effective in practice. This kind of skill can produce results that appear extraordinary, not because they rely on advanced technology, but because they are applied with consistency and depth. If such skills are not passed on, if the chain of teaching is broken, they can be lost within a generation or two, leaving behind only the finished work as evidence of what was once possible. Another factor to consider is organization. The construction of the pyramid was not just a technical achievement, but a logistical one. It required coordination of labor, resources, timing, and planning on a scale that few societies have achieved. This kind of organization is not permanent. It depends on stability, on leadership, on systems that can manage large numbers of people and maintain focus over long periods. If those systems weaken, if priorities shift, if resources become limited, the ability to carry out such projects can diminish, even if the underlying knowledge still exists in some form. The techniques may remain, but without the structure to support them, they are no longer applied at the same scale. Environmental changes may also play a role. The Nile, which supported much of ancient Egyptian life, did not behave the same way in every period. Variations in flooding, changes in climate, shifts in available resources could all influence what was possible at a given time. If transportation becomes more difficult, if materials are harder to access, if food production is affected, the focus of a society may move away from large-scale construction toward more immediate needs. In such conditions, specialized knowledge may be set aside, not because it is no longer understood, but because it is no longer practical to apply. Over time, without use, that knowledge can become less precise, less complete, until only fragments remain. There is also the question of intention. It is possible that the techniques used to build the Great Pyramid were not widely shared, that they were held within specific groups, passed down among those directly involved in construction. If this knowledge was considered valuable, even sacred, it may have been protected, restricted, not openly documented. In such cases, the loss of a small group could result in the loss of an entire set of methods. This would not leave behind clear evidence of what was lost, only the absence of those techniques in later work. The idea of lost knowledge often carries a sense of something dramatic, something hidden or deliberately concealed, but in many cases, it may be far more ordinary. Skills fade when they are not used. Methods disappear when they are not needed. Traditions change when circumstances shift. The result is not a sudden break, but a gradual narrowing, where only certain aspects of knowledge continue while others fall away. When we look at the pyramid through this lens, it becomes less of an isolated mystery and more of a reminder of how knowledge behaves over time. It can grow, reach a peak, and then recede, leaving behind markers of what was once possible. These markers can appear out of place when the context that produced them is no longer visible. They can seem more advanced than their surroundings, not because they belong to a different time, but because the conditions that supported them are no longer present. This perspective does not solve every question. It does not fully explain the precision, the scale, the consistency of the work. but it offers a way to understand how such achievements could exist without requiring explanations that fall outside known human capability. It suggests that what we see is not beyond human reach, but beyond our current reconstruction of how it was done. As we consider what may have been forgotten, the focus shifts from the structure itself to the process behind it. The pyramid is the final result, the visible outcome of countless decisions, adjustments, and actions that took place over years. Those actions are no longer directly accessible. We can study the stones, measure the angles, analyze the materials, but the moment of creation, the exact sequence of steps, the subtle techniques applied by those who built it, remains out of reach. It exists only as an imprint, something that can be inferred but not fully recovered. And in that distance between what remains and what was once known, the idea of lost techniques begins to take shape, not as a mystery of unknown forces, but as a quiet gap in continuity, a space where knowledge once existed, was used with precision and confidence, and then slowly faded, leaving behind a structure that continues to reflect it, even as the methods themselves have slipped away. We leave behind techniques that may have faded with time, to everything that still refuses to settle into a clear answer. Because after all the measurements, all the theories, all the careful reconstructions of how it might have been done, there remains a quiet space at the center of it all, a place where explanation slows down and uncertainty takes its place. The Great Pyramid has been studied from every angle, measured down to the smallest variation, scanned for hidden spaces, compared against other structures, and yet it does not fully resolve. It does not become simple. Instead, the more we understand, the more we begin to see how much of it sits just beyond complete explanation, not because it is unknowable, but because the full context in which it was created no longer exists. We can describe the stones, the tools, the organization, the beliefs, but bringing all of those elements together into a single, seamless picture still feels slightly out of reach. There is always a small gap, a place where the explanation feels almost complete, but not entirely. It is in that space that the pyramid continues to hold its presence, not as a problem waiting to be solved, but as a reminder that understanding is not always absolute. One of the most persistent questions is not about any single detail, but about the combination of all of them. Each element on its own can be approached: the cutting of stone, the transport, the alignment, the internal design, the cultural context. But when all of these are considered together, when we try to imagine the entire process unfolding in real time, sustained over years with consistency and precision, the scale of coordination begins to feel extraordinary. It is not just that the pyramid was built, but that it was built with such control, with so little visible deviation from its intended form. This suggests a level of planning that extends far beyond individual tasks, a system that could maintain accuracy across distance and time without drifting away from its original design. How that system functioned in full detail remains unclear. We can outline its parts, but the complete structure of it, the way information flowed, the way decisions were made and adjusted, is still only partially visible. There are also questions that arise from what is not there: the absence of detailed records describing the construction, the lack of explicit instructions carved into the structure itself. While some markings exist, they do not provide a full account of how the pyramid was built. This absence does not mean that such knowledge did not exist, but it does mean that we are working with fragments, reconstructing a process from evidence that was never intended to serve as a complete guide. This creates a situation where multiple explanations can coexist, each addressing certain aspects while leaving others open. It is not that we have no answers, but that the answers we have do not fully close the question. The pyramid also raises broader considerations about how we understand the past. It challenges the assumption that progress is always visible, always documented, always moving forward in a clear line. Instead, it suggests that there can be moments where capability reaches a level that is not fully sustained, where knowledge is applied with precision and then gradually shifts, leaving behind results that seem difficult to place within a linear narrative. This does not mean that the past was more advanced in every way, but it does indicate that certain areas of understanding may have been developed in ways that are not fully captured by our current models. The pyramid becomes one of those points, a place where expectation and evidence do not align perfectly, creating a tension that invites continued exploration. Even with modern technology, which allows us to see inside the structure without physically opening it, to detect voids, to analyze materials at microscopic levels, the core experience of the pyramid remains unchanged. It is still a massive form rising from the ground, still aligned with the world around it, still composed of stones placed with care. Technology adds layers of information, but it does not replace the sense of presence that the structure carries. It does not remove the questions. If anything, it refines them, making them more specific, more focused, but not necessarily easier to answer. This is perhaps one of the most important aspects of the pyramid, that it continues to engage with those who study it, not as a solved problem, but as an ongoing conversation between what is known and what is still being explored. There are also the questions that extend beyond the pyramid itself, how it relates to the broader landscape, to the other structures on the Giza plateau, to the patterns that appear across different cultures and regions. While each site has its own context, its own history, the similarities in form, in alignment, in the use of geometry suggest that there may be underlying principles that were recognized and applied in multiple places. Whether these principles were shared, discovered independently, or simply reflect common responses to similar challenges is still uncertain. What is clear is that the pyramid is not isolated in its complexity, but part of a larger pattern of human activity that continues to be studied and reinterpreted. As we reach the end of this journey, moving from the outer form to the inner spaces, from the tools and techniques to the beliefs and possibilities, the pyramid stands not as a final answer, but as a point of reflection. It gathers all of these elements together, holding them in a form that is both stable and open, complete in its construction, yet incomplete in its explanation. It does not demand a single interpretation. Instead, it allows for multiple perspectives to exist side by side, each one contributing to a broader understanding without fully closing the question. And perhaps that is what gives it its lasting presence, not just its size, or its age, or its precision, but its ability to remain relevant, to continue inviting attention, to hold a space where curiosity can exist without being forced into certainty. Because in the end, the Great Pyramid is not only something that was built in the past, it is something that continues to exist in the present, not just physically, but as an idea, as a question, as a reminder that even in a world where so much has been explained, there are still places where understanding remains open, where the line between what we know and what we are still trying to understand is not fixed, but gently shifting. And as that realization settles in, slowly, quietly, the pyramid remains where it has always been, unchanged in form, yet endlessly changing in meaning, asking not for a final answer, but for continued attention, continued curiosity, and a willingness to accept that some of the most important questions are the ones that remain patiently without resolution.